That engine had defeated 6 certified technicians over 4 days. It had brought the head of engineering at Sterling Motors, a man with a master's degree from MIT and 17 years of professional credentials behind his name, to sign a failure report with a hand that wasn't entirely steady. It had nearly swallowed a $5 million contract whole, the kind of contract that took Evelyn Hartwell 3 years to build and 1 weekend to almost lose. And then, at 11 o'clock on a Thursday night, a man in a faded gray t-shirt walked into the service bay. His hand still carried the faint trace of engine oil from the afternoon shift he'd finished 4 hours earlier. His 6-year-old son was asleep in the truck parked outside, a small red toy toolbox tucked under one arm. The man walked to the car without greeting anyone, without asking any questions. He stood in front of the engine for a long moment, very still, and then he said, quietly and without any drama at all, "I know where the problem is." What happens when the man everyone dismissed is the only one who can save everything? The garage was called Mercer Auto, and it sat on the eastern edge of town where the streets got quieter and the buildings got shorter and nobody wore a tie. It was a 2-bay operation in a building that had been a furniture repair shop in a previous life, and it still had the old smell of sawdust underneath the newer smell of motor oil and brake fluid. The sign out front was hand-painted. The lift was second-hand, but every tool on the wall hung in its exact place, sorted by function and by size, and the floor was swept clean at the end of every working day without exception. Owen Mercer ran the shop the way he ran everything, without announcement, without decoration, and with a precision that most people who came in for an oil change never noticed and never needed to. Owen was 36 years old and looked it in the honest way that comes from working with your hands in all weather. He was tall and lean with dark brown hair and a face that didn't offer much away unless you knew how to look. He didn't talk much to customers beyond what the job required. He didn't explain himself. He didn't volunteer his history. When people asked how long he'd been doing this, he said a few years, which was technically true if you counted only the years at Mercer Auto and ignored everything that came before. In the bottom drawer of the wooden desk in the corner, the desk that held the shop's invoice book and a battery-operated radio and not much else, there was a folded document in a manila envelope. It was a certificate of appointment from Veltec Motorsport, a German mechanical engineering firm that consulted for European supercar manufacturers, naming Owen Mercer as chief engine architect at the age of 31, the youngest in the company's history. The envelope had not been opened in 2 years. In the corner of the shop, on a wooden stool with a cushion tied to the seat, sat Isaac. He was 6 years old and serious, in the way that small children sometimes are when they have been paying close attention to the world for their entire short lives. He had his father's dark eyes and his mother's habit of going quiet when something was bothering him. Every afternoon after school he came to the shop, sat on the stool, and opened his red toy toolbox, a battered plastic thing with a yellow latch that he had owned since he was 3. He would lay out the toy wrench and the toy screwdriver and the toy ratchet on the floor in front of him, and then he would crouch over whatever piece of scrap metal Owen had set aside for him and pretend to work. He took it seriously. He always had. On the shelf above Owen's desk, beside the radio and the invoice book, there was a thick notebook with a brown leather cover. It was filled front to back in Owen's handwriting notes on classic European engines, hand-drawn diagrams, annotated references, the accumulated record of 3 years of independent research. On the inside cover, in the same careful hand, was a single line, for M. Beside it, smaller, almost invisible, and for whoever comes after. Across town, on the main boulevard, where the buildings had glass facades and the parking valets wore matching blazers, Sterling Motors occupied a full city block. The banner stretched across the upper story of the building read, "Private Exhibition Special Classic Collection Friday, 7 p.m. It was the most important event on Evelyn Hartwell's calendar for the year, and it had been for the past 8 months. Evelyn was 32 years old and ran Sterling Motors with the kind of focused intensity that made her good at her job and occasionally difficult to be around. She had taken over the dealership from her father at 28, rebuilt the clientele in 3 years, and positioned Sterling Motors as the premier destination for classic and collector vehicles on the eastern seaboard. She was precise, she was demanding, and she did not believe in second chances for people who wasted her time. She also had not slept properly in 4 days. Isaac noticed the Sterling Motors banner through the shop window one afternoon while Owen was finishing a brake job on a sedan. The boy pressed his nose against the glass and studied the photograph of the cars. Then he looked back at his father. "Dad," he said, "do you think you could fix those?" Owen glanced at the banner. He didn't answer. He turned back to the brake caliper and kept working. On Monday morning, Owen drove to Sterling Motors to pick up a parts order. He did this because the specific component he needed, a fuel delivery valve for a 1970s Italian roadster he was restoring for a private client, was only available through a supplier that Sterling Motors imported exclusively, and the wait time for a direct order was 6 weeks. Owen had called ahead. He had a confirmation number. He brought Isaac because school didn't start until 9, and it was only a quick pickup. He wore what he always wore: work pants, steel-toed boots, a clean but well-worn jacket. Isaac carried his red toolbox, as he almost always did when they went anywhere together, the way other children carry stuffed animals. The showroom floor of Sterling Motors was everything Mercer Auto was not. High ceilings, recessed lighting, cars displayed like sculpture on platforms of polished concrete. The staff moved in quiet clusters and spoke at the volume of a library. Owen went to the parts counter, gave his confirmation number, and waited. Isaac stood beside him and looked up at a silver 1962 Ferrari on the nearest platform with an expression of pure, uncomplicated awe. Jason Caldwell came through the door behind the counter before the parts clerk could respond to the confirmation number. He was the head of technical services at Sterling Motors, 40 years old, broad-shouldered, with the particular confidence of a man who had never in his professional life been told he was wrong by anyone whose opinion he respected. He looked at Owen once, from the top of his head to the toes of his boots, with the efficient thoroughness of a man cataloging something he intends to discard. Then he looked at Isaac and at the red plastic toolbox. He said, loudly enough for the nearest cluster of staff and the 2 customers browsing the showroom floor to hear without difficulty, "This counter isn't a walk-in service desk for backyard mechanics. If you need parts, there's an auto supply warehouse on Route 9. He paused for exactly long enough to make the next part land. "And bring your kid to a place like this again, and I'll have security escort you out. This isn't a playground." The showroom went quiet in the small, specific way that spaces go quiet when something has happened that everyone present has decided not to acknowledge. One of the browsing customers turned slightly away. A staff member near the far wall found something on her clipboard to look at. Isaac stopped looking at the Ferrari. He looked down at the red toolbox in his hands instead, and then he pressed it against his chest. Owen did not raise his voice. He did not change his expression. He looked at Jason Caldwell for approximately 2 seconds, a look that was perfectly flat and perfectly still, and somehow more uncomfortable than anger would have been, and then he looked at Isaac. He said nothing to Caldwell. He simply waited at the counter until the parts clerk, clearly wanting the interaction to end, processed the confirmation number and brought the component from the warehouse. Owen signed for it, tucked the box under his arm, and walked to the door. Isaac fell in beside him. Just before they reached the exit, Isaac said quietly, "Dad, let's go." And they did. On the second floor, behind the long window that overlooked the showroom floor, Evelyn Hartwell had watched the exchange. She had seen Jason's performance, and she had seen the man in work clothes, and she had seen the small boy with the red plastic box pressed to his chest. She had not intervened. She had looked back at her phone. She had walked away. She told herself it was because she hadn't heard everything clearly. She would think about that later, in the dark, in the quiet of the shop floor on Thursday night, and she would know that wasn't true. The Lamborghini Miura S had been built in 1971 and was one of fewer than 800 ever made. The specific example in Sterling Motors' service bay had been modified in the 1990s by an Italian engineer named Maurizio Rinaldi, who had worked for a small Milanese firm that specialized in the mechanical restoration of pre-emissions-era European automobiles. Rinaldi had died in 2004, and he had left behind no written documentation of his modifications, no drawings, no service manuals, no annotated schematics. What he had left behind was a V12 engine that ran, by all accounts, better than the day it left the Santa Gata factory until 4 days ago, when it had simply stopped. Not gradually. Not with warning. It had stopped between one firing cycle and the next, as completely as if someone had switched it off at a source that no diagnostic instrument could locate. Harold Voss, who owned the car, and 9 others in the collection he had placed on consignment with Sterling Motors, had called Evelyn personally. His voice had been calm. That was worse than shouting. If the Miura was not running, and on display by Friday at 7 p.m., he said, he would withdraw the consignment agreement in its entirety. $4.8 million in inventory. Gone. The exhibition, Sterling Motors' most visible event in 3 years, reduced to a gap on a platform and a conversation that Evelyn did not want to have. 6 of Sterling Motors' certified technicians had worked on the Miura, one after another, and then in combinations over 4 days. None of them found the fault. The diagnostic system produced contradictory error codes that pointed in 3 different directions simultaneously and resolved none of them. Jason Caldwell, who had spent the better part of the 4th day under the hood, wrote in his technical report, "Engine unrecoverable. Recommend client notification of irreversible mechanical failure." Evelyn read the report, set it face down on her desk, and called 3 independent specialists. The first declined when he heard the car's name and year too complex. He said, "Not enough documentation." The second quoted a timeline of 8 weeks and a fee that started at $500,000. The third drove in from 2 hours away, walked around the Miura for 15 minutes in the service bay, and then walked back to his car and drove home. He called Evelyn from the road. "I don't know what Rinaldi did to that engine," he said, "and because I don't know, I can't fix it without risking making it worse. I'm sorry." Evelyn stood alone in the service bay after the call ended. The Miura sat under the shop lights in its orange paint, which was the color of something expensive and unapologetic. She put one hand on the hood and looked at it for a long time. It was Monday evening. Friday was 4 days away. On Monday evening, Owen drove home, collected Isaac from the neighbor who had picked him up from school, and made dinner for the 2 of them: pasta, a green salad, a glass of water for himself, and apple juice for the boy. They ate at the small kitchen table with the window open to the backyard. Isaac was quieter than usual. He ate his pasta in careful, measured forkfuls and didn't ask for a second serving. Afterward, they sat on the back step with the last of the daylight, Isaac turning his toy screwdriver over in his hands. He had been thinking since the morning. Owen could tell because the boy had his mother's thinking face, a slight downward pull at the corners of his mouth, a stillness in the eyes. Finally, Isaac asked, "Dad, why did that man talk to you like that?" Owen looked out over the yard, where a maple tree was just beginning to turn at the edges. He let the question sit for a moment. "He didn't know who he was talking to," Owen said. "Does that make it okay?" "No," Owen said. "It doesn't." Isaac turned the screwdriver over again. "Why didn't you say anything back?" Owen reached over and put a hand on the boy's shoulder briefly, the way he touched things he cared about without performance, without excess. Some things don't need to be said. They only need to be done. Isaac looked at him. He was 6, and there was a limit to what 6 years of living could do with a statement like that. But he nodded, because he trusted his father in the wordless, complete way that children trust the people who have never once given them a reason not to. Inside, after Isaac was asleep, Owen stood at the kitchen shelf and looked at the brown leather notebook. He had not opened it in several months. It held, among other things, 47 pages of research on Maurizio Rinaldi's engineering methodology, the culmination of 3 years of independent study that Owen had pursued alongside his work at Veltec Motorsport during the years when he had still believed he would one day write something definitive and useful about the way certain engineers understood machines not as mechanical systems, but as acoustic ones. Rinaldi had been the greatest of these. He had designed engines the way composers write for string quartets, each component calibrated not just for function but for resonance, for the specific frequency at which the whole assembly would operate as a single coherent system rather than a collection of individual parts. The research had begun as professional interest. It had become something close to obsession. And then Mara had died. on a Tuesday afternoon in November, on a road she drove every day, and Owen had closed the notebook and put it on the shelf, and driven himself and a 3-year-old Isaac back to this town where he had grown up, and opened the shop, and not looked back. Not because he was afraid of looking back, but because there was a boy who needed a father who was present, and Owen Mercer, above all things, knew how to be present. Tuesday brought no progress for Evelyn. She brought in a restoration team from the city specialists with a strong reputation for pre-war European vehicles. They worked through the day. That evening, their team leader sat across from Evelyn in the conference room and was honest in the way that only people who are genuinely stumped can afford to be. "Whatever Rinaldi did to that engine," he said, "he did it according to a logic that doesn't exist in any documentation I've ever encountered. The modifications are there, we can see them, but we don't understand the system they create. We're afraid to go further without that understanding, because the wrong move could cause irreversible damage." He paused. "I think the person who can fix this engine is someone who has spent a great deal of time specifically studying how Rinaldi worked. Not just classic car mechanics, Rinaldi himself." On Wednesday morning, Jason Caldwell proposed using a substitute vehicle, a Miura, from 1969, that was close enough in appearance that most guests at the exhibition would not know the difference. Evelyn rejected this in under 10 seconds. "That's not Harold's car," she said. "It's not what we agreed to display. We don't do that." Jason gave her a long look. She gave it back without blinking, and he left the room. Evelyn was not a sentimental person, and she was not particularly given to principle for its own sake, but there were lines she did not cross in business. She had watched her father cross them, and she had watched what they cost him in the end, and she had decided early that her version of Sterling Motors would not be built that way. On Thursday morning, Diana set a single sheet of paper on Evelyn's desk and stood back without saying anything. The paper had 2 items on it. The first was a name, Owen Mercer, Mercer Auto, followed by an address on the east side of town. Below the name Diana had written, in her precise small handwriting, what a contact in the industry had told her. Owen Mercer, former chief engine architect, Veltec Motorsport, left the company 3 years ago. Has not returned to the industry. He wrote the most comprehensive existing analysis of Rinaldi's engineering methodology, an unpublished thesis that is cited in 2 academic papers and 1 industry journal. Currently operates a one-man auto repair shop. Single father. Evelyn read the page twice. She looked at Diana. "This is the man from Monday." It was not a question. Diana said nothing. She didn't need to. Evelyn looked out the window for a moment and then said, "Set up a meeting for tonight." She paused. "I'll go myself." Owen was finishing the last job of the day, a routine coolant flush on a pickup truck, when he heard footsteps behind him that didn't belong in his shop. Heels on concrete have a specific sound, and that sound had no business being in Mercer Auto at 8:30 on a Thursday evening. He rolled out from under the truck and stood up. Evelyn Hartwell was standing in the doorway of the bay, her jacket still on, her dark hair pulled back, a leather portfolio under one arm. Diana stood a step behind her. Owen recognized Evelyn immediately. She was the woman on the second floor, the one who had looked down at the showroom and then looked away. She recognized him, too. He could see it in the slight adjustment in her posture. Not an apology, not yet, but an acknowledgement that she owed him something she wasn't entirely sure how to pay. Evelyn did not waste time on preamble. "I have a 1971 Lamborghini Miura S with a modified V12 engine. Non-standard modifications, no documentation. 6 technicians, 2 outside teams, 4 days nobody can fix it. The exhibition is tomorrow at 7 p.m. I need you." Owen wiped his hands on a shop rag and looked at her. He did not rush to fill the silence. After a moment, Evelyn said, more quietly, "I know you came to our facility on Monday. I know what happened. I was there, and I didn't stop it. That was wrong of me." She didn't elaborate. She wasn't a woman who expanded on apologies, but she had said it, plainly, and she meant it. And Owen heard both things, the words and the fact of them. "What did your technicians do to it?" Owen asked. She described the 4 days in detail, every attempt, every instrument used, every proposed solution. Owen listened without interruption. When she was finished, he asked one question. "Who modified the engine last?" An engineer named Rinaldi, Evelyn said. Maurizio Rinaldi. He died in 2004. For the first time since she had walked through the door, something changed in Owen's face. Not a dramatic shift, a small thing, a stillness becoming a different kind of stillness. You know him, Evelyn said. It was not quite a question. I know his work, Owen said. There's a difference. He glanced across the bay to where Isaac was curled on the wooden stool under a blanket, asleep with the red plastic toolbox held loosely in one small hand. He looked at it for a moment. Then he looked back at Evelyn. I'll come and look at it, he said. I'm not making any promises. He locked the shop, drove Isaac to Eleanor Collins' house 3 streets over. Eleanor was 64 and had watched Isaac through 2 bouts of the flu and a broken collarbone, and a phase where he would only eat beige foods, and she opened the door without a word, took one look at the bag of tools Owen was carrying, and nodded, and drove to Sterling Motors. The service bay was empty except for the 3 of them in the car. The Miura sat under the overhead lights in its deep orange paint, and even standing still in a fluorescent-lit workshop, it had a quality that was difficult to name. Something about the proportions, the low and aggressive stance, the way the light moved across the long hood. Owen stood in front of it for a long moment without touching it. Then he walked around it once, slowly, his hands at his sides. Then again, Evelyn watched from a stool she had pulled to the far end of the bay. She had folded her jacket over her lap, and she sat with the particular stillness of someone exercising restraint. Diana stood near the door. Jason Caldwell had been in the building when Owen arrived. He had seen who Evelyn had called in, and he had left without saying anything, his expression carrying the specific quality of contempt that is shading over into something else and hasn't quite decided what. Owen opened the hood. He looked at the engine without touching it, just looked, the way he looked at everything before he touched it, which was the first habit he had developed when he was young and which he had never lost. Then he reached into his bag and took out a modified stethoscope, the chest piece replaced with a small metal probe, the tubing extended, the earpieces cushioned. He began placing the probe against the engine block, systematically, moving from point to point in a pattern that made no immediate sense from the outside, but was in fact a precise sequence derived from diagrams in the brown leather notebook now open on the workbench beside him. He listened. The bay was silent enough that the only sounds were the faint tick of cooling metal and the occasional distant noise from the street. Evelyn held her position for 20 minutes. Then she stood up and walked halfway toward the car. Have you found something? Owen said, without looking up. Not yet, but I know what I'm looking for. She asked what that was, and he straightened slightly and told her, Rinaldi didn't engineer conventionally. He engineered acoustically. Every component was calibrated to resonate at a specific frequency so that the system as a whole operated as a single harmonic unit. If one component is displaced even fractionally from its designed position, the resonance breaks and the whole system shuts down. Not gradually, instantly. There's no error code for it because no diagnostic software was ever written to measure it. You'd have to know it was possible before you could look for it. Evelyn was quiet for a moment. Where did you learn that? I spent 3 years studying Rinaldi's work, Owen said, returning to the stethoscope. I was going to write a thesis about it. What happened? She asked it quietly, the way you ask a question, when you already suspect the answer might be something you don't have the right to hear. Owen said, My wife died. After that, I wasn't interested in writing anymore. He said it the same way. He said everything, without softness, without hardness, just the plain weight of the fact. Evelyn looked at the Miura's engine and said nothing. It was 1 in the morning when he found it. He had removed the 4th layer of the fuel delivery assembly, working with the patience of someone who understands that urgency and speed are not the same thing, and there, tucked between the primary and secondary fuel rails, was a wafer-thin thermal isolation plate that had no business being there according to any factory specification. Rinaldi had fabricated it himself from a titanium-copper alloy, approximately 2 millimeters in thickness, positioned with tolerances measured in tenths of a millimeter. One of the previous technicians, almost certainly, while attempting to investigate the fuel delivery system, had displaced it by 0.3 of a millimeter, enough to break the resonance, enough to kill the engine as completely as a power cut. Owen straightened up and looked at the plate in the light. "The problem is here," he said. "This piece needs to be refabricated and repositioned. The original has been microfractured probably when it was moved, and it won't hold." Evelyn said, "It's 1 in the morning. I know. I need 40 grams of titanium copper alloy and a handheld grinder with a fine-grade wheel." She looked at him for a second. Then she picked up her phone. It took her 40 minutes, 3 phone calls, and a $200 surcharge to a 24-hour metal fabrication shop across town. But she got it. Owen worked for 2 more hours. He fabricated the replacement plate on the workbench using the grinder, the original as a template, and calipers that measured in hundredths of a millimeter. He checked the thickness at 11 points. He checked it again. Then he reseated the assembly layer by layer. Each component returned to its exact position in the sequence he had documented before disassembly. His hands did not rush. His hands never rushed. They moved with the particular efficiency of someone who had performed 10,000 versions of this motion and no longer needed to think about any of them. Evelyn watched without speaking. At some point, Diana had quietly brought 2 coffees from a machine somewhere in the building and left one on the bench near Owen and one near Evelyn and retreated without comment. At 3:45 in the morning, Owen closed the engine cover, set down his tools, and looked at the Miura. "Start it?" he said. Evelyn climbed into the driver's seat. She put the key in the ignition. She turned it. The V12 engine turned over, caught, and opened into a sound that filled the service bay completely. Not the stuttering, uncertain sound of a sick engine trying, but a deep, even, authoritative bellow that settled immediately into a low, resonant idle. It was the sound of something that knew exactly what it was. Evelyn sat in the driver's seat with both hands on the wheel and did not move for a long moment. Then she closed her eyes. When she opened them, Owen was wiping down his tools and placing them, one by one, back in the bag. He was at the door with his bag over his shoulder before Evelyn got out of the car. "I'll send an invoice by email," he said. "My rates are standard. The parts cost is on top. I want to know what to pay you," she said. "You'll get what I send." He looked at Isaac asleep on the stool he had brought the boy in after midnight, and Eleanor had carried him inside and settled him there without being asked, and then he picked Isaac up, settled the boy against his shoulder, and picked up the red toolbox in the same hand. Isaac stirred, but did not wake. Owen walked to his truck in the pre-dawn dark, buckled Isaac into the back seat, and drove home. He got there at 6:15. He drank a coffee at the kitchen table in the quiet house, while the street outside slowly filled with the sounds of a neighborhood waking up. He was still there when Isaac came downstairs at 6:45, blinking and confused, still in the clothes he'd gone to sleep in. "Dad, where did we go?" "I fixed a car," Owen said. "A nice one," Isaac said, not as a question, more as a statement of what he expected from his father's nights. "Yes," Owen said. "I think you'd like it." Diana put a tablet in front of Evelyn at 7:30 that morning, before Evelyn had finished her first coffee. On the screen was an article from a German automotive engineering journal, dated 2019. The headline read, "Veltec Motorsport appoints Owen Mercer as chief engine architect youngest in company history." The photograph showed Owen in a suit, standing beside an engine prototype, facing a bank of cameras, with the expression of a man who would rather be working on the engine than standing next to it for a photograph. Below the article, Diana had pulled up a citation from an academic paper on pre-emissions European powertrains, a paper from 2020 that referenced, in a footnote, an unpublished research thesis by Owen Mercer of Veltec Motorsport's research division, described as the most thorough existing analysis of Rinaldi's engineering methodology. Diana said, quietly, "He didn't just know about Rinaldi. He is the foremost living authority on Rinaldi's work." Evelyn set down her coffee cup. She looked at the photograph for a long time, the younger face, the same flat, steady eyes, the hands that even in a posed photograph looked like they were resting and not performing. She thought about the man in the work jacket at the parts counter on Monday morning, the boy with the red plastic toolbox. The way Owen had looked at Jason Caldwell for exactly 2 seconds and said nothing and walked out. She thought about all the things that look had contained, and all the things he had not bothered to say because he hadn't needed to. She picked up her coffee again. "Where is Jason?" she asked. Diana told her. "Send him in," Evelyn said. The exhibition that Friday evening was everything it was meant to be. Sterling Motors' main floor was remade into something between a gallery and a concert hall. Warm light, careful spacing between cars, a string quartet in the corner playing something European and unhurried. The guests came in their good clothes and moved slowly between the vehicles, with the particular reverence that expensive, beautiful things tend to produce in people who can afford them. At the center of the display, on the raised platform in the middle of the room, the 1971 Lamborghini Miura S sat in its deep orange paint, under a light that had been angled specifically to catch the curves of the hood. Its engine was running. The sound it produced was barely audible in the room, a low, settled vibration that you felt more in your chest than heard with your ears, but it was there, and it was perfect, and every person in the room who knew anything about these cars knew what it meant that it was there. Harold Voss arrived at 7:15, 20 minutes past the start time, the way men of his particular standing arrive at events unhurried, aware that the room will wait. He was 72, white-haired, and had the bearing of someone who had spent 60 years surrounded by things of exceptional quality and had developed the ability to recognize them without effort. He walked straight to the Miura and put his hand on the hood above the engine and felt the vibration and stood there for a moment with an expression that was not public. Then he found Evelyn. "You did it," he said. Not an accusation, not excessive praise, simply a statement from a man who had not entirely believed it would be done. "I had help," Evelyn said. Harold looked at her carefully. He had done business with Evelyn for 3 years, and he had never heard her use that particular word in relation to herself. "Who?" Evelyn said. "Owen Mercer." Harold Voss was quiet for the span of 3 seconds. Then he said slowly, "The Mercer who wrote the Rinaldi thesis." "Yes." "Good God." He looked at the Miura and then back at her. "I read that thesis before it was even finished. A colleague at Veltec sent me 40 pages of it as a draft. I thought whoever wrote it must have spent half a lifetime on it." He paused. "What is he doing now?" "He has a small shop," Evelyn said, "on the east side. He does general repair work." Harold looked at her with an expression that was not quite pity and not quite admiration, but somewhere between the two, aimed at life itself and the strange arrangements it produced. "Some men choose the life they choose," he said. "That's worth respecting." He moved away to rejoin the other guests. Evelyn watched him go, and then she looked at the Miura, and then she looked at the space above the street through the tall windows. She stayed there for longer than the evening required. Jason Caldwell had been reassigned on Friday morning. Not dismissed, Evelyn was not careless about employment, and what Jason Caldwell had done at the parts counter on Monday was not a terminable offense in any legal sense. But he had publicly belittled a customer on her premises, and that customer had turned out to be the only person in the relevant professional world capable of fixing the problem Jason himself had declared unfixable. The reassignment was to a standard technician role, 2 levels below his previous position. There was no performance review, no disciplinary letter. Evelyn simply told him, in the same tone she used to discuss quarterly inventory projections, what his new role was and when it would begin. Jason had stood in her office with his jaw set and had not argued, because there was nothing to argue. He knew what he had done, and he knew what it had cost, and the calculation required no explanation from either party. Owen's invoice arrived on Saturday morning, as promised. The number was reasonable in the way that the invoices of people who are very good at things and have stopped needing to charge what they're worth tend to be reasonable. Evelyn looked at it for a moment, and then did the math. And then she opened her banking application and transferred 3 times the invoiced amount into the account listed. She did not include a note. She assumed he would understand. He did. He saw the notification while he was halfway through pulling the engine on a 1990-something sedan that had come in that morning. And he looked at the number on the screen, and he felt something that was not surprise. He had expected something like this from Evelyn Hartwell, whom he had assessed correctly in the first 20 minutes, and then he put the phone in his pocket and went back to the engine. 3 days later, a white envelope arrived at the shop by regular mail. Inside was a business card plain, heavy stock, the name Harold Voss, in small capital letters with a phone number and nothing else. On the back, handwritten, "When you're ready to talk not about cars, but about what you still want to do, call me." Owen held the card for a moment. Then he put it on the shelf beside the brown leather notebook. On Sunday afternoon, Owen took Isaac to the park 2 blocks from their house. It was the kind of afternoon that exists specifically to make cities feel habitable. The temperature exactly right, the light coming through the trees at a useful angle, the benches occupied by the kinds of people who have nowhere more important to be. Owen sat on the bench nearest the oak trees with a thermos of coffee. Isaac ran in wide circles with his red toolbox, performing some elaborate private operation that involved inspecting the bases of trees for structural faults. Owen watched him and drank his coffee, and was thinking about nothing in particular when he heard footsteps on the path and looked up. Evelyn Hartwell was walking toward the bench from the direction of the main gate. She was wearing something that wasn't work clothes, which made her look like a slightly different version of herself. Same posture, same economy of movement, but without the professional architecture. She had recognized him before he recognized her. She stopped about 6 feet away, and they looked at each other. Neither of them said anything for a moment, which under other circumstances might have been awkward, and under these circumstances simply was what it was. Isaac came pelting back from the tree line, skidded to a stop, looked at Evelyn, and looked at his father. "Do you know her?" he asked. "Yes," Owen said. Isaac looked at Evelyn. "Does he know you because of cars?" Evelyn glanced at Owen. Something moved at the corner of her mouth. "He helped me fix one," she said. Isaac considered this. "Was it a good one?" "Very good," she said. Isaac nodded, satisfied with this answer as a complete account of the matter, and ran back to the trees. Owen moved along the bench slightly, not an invitation, not its opposite, just space. Evelyn sat down. They were quiet for a moment, watching Isaac conduct his inspection at the base of a particularly large oak. Evelyn said, "You received the transfer." "Yes," Owen said. "You didn't object. I don't do charity." She looked at him. "No," she said, "you don't." She looked forward again. The park made comfortable sounds around them, children, birds, the distant noise of the city containing itself in the afternoon. "Are you going to call Harold?" Evelyn asked. Owen turned his coffee thermos in his hands. "I don't know. Isaac's still young." "That's not really an answer. It's the true one." He said it without deflection, without apology. She looked at him for a moment and then looked back at the field where Isaac was now sitting cross-legged on the grass with his toolbox open, arranging the contents in a row in front of him, with the seriousness of someone conducting inventory. Evelyn said, "What you did Thursday night, not just the technical part, the whole thing. Most people in your position would have let Sterling Motors fail. Most people in my position weren't there," Owen said. She turned and looked at him directly for the first time since she had sat down. He looked back. "If there's ever a day when you want to do something more than repair ordinary cars," she said, "I would like to be the first person you call." Owen held her gaze. "Why?" She paused for a moment, not because she didn't have the answer, but because she was deciding how much of it was appropriate to give. "Because I know what I did on Monday," she said, "and I don't like being in debt." She stood, tucked her hands in her jacket pockets, and walked back the way she had come unhurried, not looking back, her footsteps steady on the path until the trees came between her and the bench. Owen watched until she was gone. Then he looked at Isaac, who had finished his inventory and was now holding up the toy wrench and examining it against the light, with the expression of a craftsman evaluating a tool. Isaac said, without looking up, "Did she leave already?" "Yes. She seemed okay." Owen looked at the path where Evelyn had walked. The light through the trees made a pattern on the ground that shifted and settled, shifted and settled. "She might be," he said. Isaac accepted this with his characteristic efficiency, put the wrench back in the toolbox, and snapped the yellow latch closed. He brought the box over and set it on the bench between them, red plastic, worn at the corners, the paint on the latch scratched from 4 years of use. He climbed up beside it and leaned against his father's arm. Owen put his arm around the boy. They sat there while the afternoon did its slow, unhurried work around them, and the red toolbox sat between the man and the space he had made on the bench, small and present and still.